In the hushed luxury of a private jet, Ms. Rebecca held her breath, every nerve tingling with dread. Her mistake had been small, a spilled cup of coffee, but the man it had scalded, Sir Andrew, was no ordinary passenger. His silence was powerful, his gaze unyielding, and in the stillness, she felt the terrifying weight of a single question. What will he do? Welcome to our channel, where stories come alive with heart-stopping suspense and unforgettable emotions. Every tale we share is crafted with passion to captivate, inspire, and move you. If you enjoy stories like these, please like, share, and subscribe. The sunlight spilled into the cabin of the private plane, casting a warm glow across the plush seats, illuminating the quiet faces of the few privileged passengers on board. Outside, the sky was a dazzling blue, untouched by a single cloud. Inside, everything seemed serene, except for the thundering heartbeat of Ms. Rebecca, the young stewardess who was doing her best to look calm and composed. Ms. Rebecca's hands were steady, but her mind was whirling. This job meant everything to her. She was new to this, and it showed in the way her eyes darted from passenger to passenger, alert to their every need. Today, especially, she couldn't afford a single mistake. She'd had a rocky start in her training, and her supervisor's words still echoed in her head. One wrong move, Rebecca, and you're done. She wasn't going to be done. She couldn't be. Not when she'd finally landed a position that could turn things around for her family. She took a deep breath, trying to settle the nerves simmering beneath her forced calm. Her next passenger was an elderly man sitting alone by the window, gazing out as if lost in his own world. His hands rested on his lap, still as stone, and his face was expressionless, almost carved from rock. He was dressed plainly, and yet there was something about him, an air of quiet authority that made him both invisible and impossible to ignore. "Good afternoon, sir," Ms. Rebecca greeted him, forcing her voice to sound steady and professional. She held a cup of freshly brewed coffee in one hand, steam curling up from the dark liquid. As she carefully extended the cup toward him, she caught a glimpse of his face, noting how his gaze seemed to drift far away, as if seeing something beyond the horizon. Something troubled. There was a weight in his expression that sent a small shiver up her spine. Who is he? She wondered, but she knew better than to ask. The plane jolted, a sudden lurch that yanked Ms. Rebecca off balance. Her grip on the coffee wavered. The cup slipped, just for an instant, and then scalding coffee splashed directly onto the man's face. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The rich scent of coffee mingled with the sudden shock in the air. The man's face twisted in pain, but he remained completely silent. He didn't shout, didn't reach up to wipe the burning liquid from his face. Instead, he gasped softly, a mere whisper of discomfort, and his expression returned to a disquieting stillness. "Sir, oh, my goodness, I'm so sorry." Ms. Rebecca stammered, her face draining of color as she fumbled for a napkin, hands shaking as she reached out to dab at his face. Please let me." Her voice cracked. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, their whispers snaking through the quiet cabin. The man didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just sat there, an unmoving, silent figure as he dabbed his own face with the napkin she'd handed him. Ms. Rebecca could see the redness beginning to bloom on his cheeks, the place where the coffee had scalded his skin. She could only imagine the pain, the sting. And yet, he said nothing. The silence grew heavier with every passing second. Her apology seemed to disappear into a void, and the man's face remained unreadable, his eyes fixed somewhere in the distance, avoiding her gaze entirely. There was no anger in his eyes, no hint of forgiveness either, just a flat, unsettling calmness that made her blood run cold. Ms. Rebecca's mind raced, scrambling to piece together the unspoken threat she felt hanging in the air. She had seen angry passengers before, had dealt with complaints and raised voices. But this man's silence, his complete lack of reaction, was like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. silent, ominous, and somehow more terrifying than any outburst could be. The quiet was suffocating. She could feel her chest tightening, panic scratching at her from the inside. What was he thinking? What would he do? His power was clear, unspoken but palpable, and she knew he was no ordinary passenger. She'd been briefed about VIP clients before boarding, and her eyes flicked to the small, simple suitcase by his feet. This man is powerful, she thought, and I'd just thrown hot coffee on his face. The weight of her mistake settled in her bones, heavy and paralyzing. She tried again, forcing the words out. "Sir, I truly apologize. I didn't mean." But her voice broke under the weight of his gaze, or lack of it. He wasn't looking at her, didn't even seem to register her presence. "Is there anything I can do?" she whispered, almost to herself, barely audible. He dabbed at his face one last time, then set the napkin down with a slow, deliberate movement. Finally, he turned his head, and his eyes met hers, dark, calm, and bottomless. Ms. Rebecca felt her breath catch. His expression was unfathomable, but there was something there, a flicker of something unspoken, and it sent a chill down her spine. "No," he replied, his voice smooth as ice, carrying a weight that felt like an unspoken promise. And then he turned back to the window, his face unreadable once more, as if the incident had never happened. Ms. Rebecca stepped back, hands trembling, pulse hammering in her ears. She'd never felt so small, so insignificant, and yet so completely under someone's scrutiny. She returned to her station, but she could feel the intensity of his silence hovering over her, like a shadow that refused to disappear. The cabin had grown colder, and Ms. Rebecca could feel the tension thickening in the air. It was as if a shadow had settled over the rows of seats, pressing down on everything with a quiet intensity that set her nerves on edge. She moved through the aisle, serving drinks and answering questions with a polite smile, but her focus was fractured, her mind churning with a single thought. Sir Andrew. Since the coffee incident, he hadn't uttered a single word to her. He hadn't asked for ice to soothe the burn, or for any follow-up service. In fact, he seemed to be in a world of his own, staring out the window as if he were somewhere far, far away. But Ms. Rebecca could feel his presence with an unsettling clarity, as if his silence were an invisible string tethering them together. She stole glances at him whenever she dared, but each time she looked, he remained motionless, his gaze locked on something beyond the clouds. And yet, she felt as if he could see her every move, that he was waiting for her to make another mistake, a slip, anything. She didn't know what he was thinking, but whatever it was, his silence felt dangerous, like he was a lion crouched, waiting to pounce. The other passengers seemed to have picked up on the tension too. Every so often, Ms. Rebecca would catch a sympathetic look, a few muttered words as they glanced between her and Sir Andrew. She knew what they were thinking, that she was at fault, that she'd made an unforgivable mistake. She could feel their judgment like a weight pressing down on her shoulders, and she flushed with embarrassment, forcing herself to focus on her duties. But no matter how hard she tried to keep herself busy, she couldn't shake the feeling that Sir Andrew was watching her, that his quiet gaze was fixed on her like a spotlight, following her every step. As the hours dragged on, her anxiety spiraled. She dealt with difficult passengers before, but never with someone like this. Sir Andrew's silence was like a void, swallowing up any sense of security she tried to cling to. With every passing second, her sense of dread grew stronger, as if a clock were ticking down to some unknown punishment. What is he planning? She wondered, her pulse pounding in her ears. The thought of what he could do, of the influence he might wield, twisted her stomach into knots. Unable to stand it any longer, she turned to her fellow stewardess, Maria, who was arranging cups on a tray nearby. Keeping her voice low, she asked, "Do you know anything about the man in seat 4B? Maria's eyes flicked to Sir Andrew, and her expression grew guarded. She leaned in closer, her voice barely a whisper. "That's Sir Andrew Westmore," she murmured, glancing over her shoulder as if making sure he couldn't hear. He's one of the airline's biggest VIP clients. He doesn't just fly first class. He practically owns the skies. Ms. Rebecca's heart dropped. She'd known he was important, but this... She could barely breathe as Maria continued, her voice tinged with awe and caution. They say he's a very private man, but he's powerful. Some people say he has connections everywhere. Government, media, business. Maria shot her a pitying look. If he wanted, he could probably buy out this entire airline just to fire someone he didn't like. Ms. Rebecca's stomach twisted painfully. She could feel her palms growing damp as Maria's words sank in. Connections everywhere. Powerful enough to destroy her with a single word. She'd spilled hot coffee on a man who could ruin her, not just here, but anywhere she tried to work. The realization settled over her like a heavy shroud. She felt small, insignificant, a single misstep from being erased from her career entirely. She thanked Maria quietly and returned to her station, trying to compose herself, but her mind was racing, filled with dark possibilities. What if he was already planning his next move? What if, as soon as they landed, she would find herself escorted off the plane, her fate already sealed by a single unspoken command? Every moment, every glance he gave her felt loaded, like he was appraising her, assessing just how much punishment she deserved. The knot in her stomach grew tighter with each passing second, her dread intensifying as she imagined his silent power. He didn't need to raise his voice or throw around threats. No, he was the kind of man who could destroy her life with a single phone call, who could eliminate any future she had with this job and make it look as easy as flicking a switch. His silence became a prison, and she was trapped inside it, waiting, terrified, for him to make a decision. She tried to focus, to keep her hand steady as she passed out drinks and responded to requests, but she couldn't escape the feeling that her fate was entirely out of her hands. The cabin seemed to grow colder and quieter, the air filled with an almost tangible suspense. She didn't dare make another mistake, not even the smallest slip. Her movements were mechanical, precise, but her heart was pounding, her pulse a drumbeat of fear echoing in her ears. As the plane continued its journey, Ms. Rebecca could feel the walls closing in, every minute stretching into an eternity. And somewhere behind her, she could sense Sir Andrew's gaze still fixed on her, steady and unyielding, as if he were waiting, just waiting, for her to finally crack. The plane's descent began with a subtle tilt, and the overhead lights dimmed slightly. Outside, the sky was a patchwork of deepening clouds, and inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension, pressing down on Ms. Rebecca until she felt she could hardly breathe. She moved about the cabin in a haze, her every thought consumed by Sir Andrew's silent, looming presence. She could still feel his gaze, somehow both cold and piercing, a weight on her back that refused to lift. Ms. Rebecca avoided looking at him, keeping her head down and eyes forward as she adjusted seatbelts and checked that everyone was secure. She told herself that the ordeal was almost over, that once the plane landed, she could disappear into the crowd, go home, and put the whole horrifying incident behind her. But even as she tried to reassure herself, she felt the futility of her hope. Deep down, she knew this was far from over. Just as she thought she might survive the descent without any further confrontation, she heard a voice behind her, calm, measured, and unmistakable. "Ms. Rebecca," Sir Andrew called, his voice somehow both soft and commanding. She froze. She knew it was him without even turning around. She forced herself to breathe and slowly turned to face him. He was looking directly at her, his eyes dark and unfathomable, his expression a strange blend of patience and something far more unsettling. Her heart hammered in her chest as she took a tentative step toward him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from trembling. "Yes, sir." Her voice was a whisper, almost choked. She could hardly bring herself to look him in the eye, but his gaze was relentless, pulling her in, pinning her down. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Swallowing hard, Ms. Rebecca obeyed, lowering herself into the seat as every nerve in her body screamed at her to run. She felt trapped, his presence filling the small space between them, her pulse roaring in her ears. Sir Andrew regarded her for a long, silent moment, and then, finally, he spoke. "I understand that accidents happen," he said, his tone cool and distant. "But I must admit, Ms. Rebecca, I'm curious about how someone with your level of training could be so careless." His words cut through her, each syllable laced with a quiet disdain that made her feel smaller and smaller. She opened her mouth to apologize, but he raised a hand, silencing her before she could utter a sound. She sat there, feeling his gaze on her like a weight, her heart sinking with each second of silence that stretched between them. "I want to understand," he continued, his voice barely more than a murmur, "why you took this job in the first place. Tell me, what brought you here?" She hesitated, thrown off by his question. She had no idea where this conversation was going, but she knew it was nowhere good. I needed a stable job," she stammered, feeling her face grow hot. "My family, we're going through some difficulties and—" He interrupted her, his eyes narrowing slightly. Yes," he said, a faint, chilling smile touching his lips. "Your mother is ill, isn't she? And your younger sister, what was her name again?" "Clara." Ms. Rebecca's heart seemed to stop. The blood drained from her face as she stared at him in horror. How does he know that? She felt a cold wave of dread wash over her, and her hands began to shake. "Oh yes," he continued, his voice smooth and unfeeling. "I know quite a lot about you, Ms. Rebecca. People in my position, well, we know things. We can reach into places you couldn't even begin to imagine." His gaze sharpened, pinning her with a dark intensity that left her feeling exposed, vulnerable, as if he'd peeled back the layers of her life and seen everything that mattered to her. He leaned forward, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "Don't think for a second that a mistake like yours will simply be forgotten. Someone in your position, with your limitations," he said, his eyes cold, "should take greater care in who they offend." Her chest tightened painfully, and she struggled to breathe. The full scope of his power, the reach of his influence, crashed over her like a tidal wave. This was not just a wealthy man. This was a man who wielded influence in a way that could tear apart her world with ease. He could ruin her career, blackball her from any respectable airline, and possibly make her personal life unravel too. For a spilled cup of coffee, he could make her entire life a living nightmare. "Please, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible, the words raw with desperation. I didn't mean to." "Didn't mean to," he echoed, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "Intent doesn't interest me, Ms. Rebecca, only the impact. And so far, your impact has been disappointing." She felt a tear slip down her cheek and quickly brushed it away, hating herself for showing weakness in front of him. But there was no hiding the fear that had lodged itself in her heart. She felt utterly powerless, trapped in this small, enclosed space with a man who seemed capable of destroying her with a single word. He leaned back, his eyes never leaving hers. "Remember, Ms. Rebecca," he said softly, his voice as cold and sharp as ice. "People like me are always watching. Mistakes, they come with consequences. Don't ever forget that." She nodded, her voice choked with terror. "Yes, sir." Satisfied, he finally looked away, his attention drifting back to the window. But even as he broke eye contact, the weight of his threat hung in the air, heavy and oppressive, a dark cloud that would follow her long after the plane touched down. As the plane made its final descent, Ms. Rebecca could only sit there, numb and paralyzed by the knowledge of what Sir Andrew could do. She was at his mercy, and she knew it all too well. The fear settled in her bones, and she understood with chilling clarity. Her life would never be the same again. The plane had finally landed, its wheels touching down with a jolt that reverberated through the cabin. But for Ms. Rebecca, the end of the flight did nothing to calm the storm raging inside her. She stood by the exit, hands clenched so tightly they trembled, each breath shallow as she braced herself for the worst. Her mind was a relentless stream of dread, picturing the many ways Sir Andrew could end her career, destroy her reputation, or even bring her family's fragile stability crashing down. Passengers began to disembark, giving her polite nods and the occasional sympathetic glance. She offered them forced smiles, her heart racing as she scanned the aisle, waiting for him, waiting for Sir Andrew. Finally, he rose from his seat and approached the door. He moved with a steady, deliberate pace, his face expressionless, eyes calm yet piercing, revealing nothing of what he might be thinking. With every step he took toward her, Ms. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken until it pounded against her ribs. When he finally stood before her, she couldn't hold back. Words tumbled from her mouth, desperate and apologetic, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I am so sorry, sir. I truly didn't mean any disrespect. I was clumsy, and Her voice broke, and she quickly looked down, unable to bear his unblinking gaze. "I would never. I only wanted to." She trailed off, feeling her cheeks burn, humiliated and frightened all at once. Sir Andrew didn't respond right away. He studied her, an inscrutable expression on his face as the silence stretched, long and agonizing. Then he leaned in close, so close that she could feel the power in his presence, that air of authority she'd felt the entire flight. His voice, when he finally spoke, was soft but charged with an intensity that made her blood run cold. "What you did today was foolish, Ms. Rebecca," he said, his tone neutral, almost dismissive. But then he paused, and a flicker of something, interest, amusement, crossed his face. "But I see something in you." Her breath caught. She looked up, heart pounding, caught completely off guard. She couldn't understand what he meant, couldn't reconcile his cold silence from earlier with the words he was speaking now. Her confusion must have shown on her face, because Sir Andrew's mouth lifted in the faintest shadow of a smile. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, elegant card. "Take this," he said, holding the card out to her. Ms. Rebecca reached for it, hands still shaking, and glanced down at the card's heavy white surface. It held only his name and a phone number. No company, no title, only Andrew Westmore. She looked back up, trying to make sense of it all. "I don't just fly in luxury, Ms. Rebecca," he continued. "I own several companies, including one that trains young professionals who have potential." His eyes softened, though his expression remained stern. "I'm willing to give you a second chance, an opportunity to prove yourself in an environment where you might make mistakes but grow stronger because of them." Her breath caught. A second chance. She'd spent the entire flight convinced he would ruin her, that he would strip her of every future she dreamed of. And now, here he was, offering her something entirely different, a path, a choice, a new beginning. I don't know what to say," she stammered, barely able to keep up with the wave of emotions flooding through her. Relief, gratitude, disbelief. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." He inclined his head slightly, the barest hint of approval in his gaze. "There's something I've learned over the years, Ms. Rebecca," he said, his voice softening just slightly. "People make mistakes, but when fear drives your actions, that's when you make your worst decisions. Remember that." He looked at her intently, as if to ensure she grasped the weight of his words. "Fear can be crippling. Don't let it be what guides you." Ms. Rebecca nodded, her throat too tight to speak. His words seemed to penetrate deep, resonating with something she hadn't realized she'd been feeling until now. She had spent the entire flight fearing him, fearing his silence, and that fear had nearly blinded her to the opportunity now standing in front of her. "I understand," she managed, her voice a whisper. "Thank you. Truly." She felt a tear slip down her cheek, but quickly brushed it away. Unable to contain her gratitude, her relief, she straightened her posture, looking him in the eye, a newfound resolve settling in her heart. She wouldn't let this chance slip away. She would prove herself, and she would no longer allow fear to control her. Sir Andrew nodded, seemingly satisfied. Without another word, he turned and stepped through the door, his figure disappearing down the jet bridge. But the weight of his presence lingered. The quiet, formidable power he held leaving a mark she would carry with her far beyond this flight. As the last passenger filed out, Ms. Rebecca clutched the card tightly, feeling a mix of awe and determination. She understood now that this moment was a turning point. Sir Andrew had given her more than a second chance. He had given her a lesson, a lifeline, and perhaps, in a strange way, his respect. With a deep breath, she stood a little taller, her nerves calming as she prepared for what lay ahead. The journey was just beginning, and she would face it without fear, carrying with her the memory of a man who had taught her the silent power of courage. Thank you for watching. We hope this story resonated with you. Don't leave without hitting that subscribe button to stay connected and let us know where you're tuning in from. Your comments and support help us bring more heartfelt tales that we hope will leave a lasting impression. Stay with us as we explore the power of storytelling, one tale at a time.